This is Declarations.
My view is that the major thing that has changed is the era of riding the beta in real estate is probably over. And the era of identifying pockets of idiosyncratic outperformance is here.
Hi, this is Todd Rich, and welcome to the Declarations podcast. Declarations is a podcast where top investors and business leaders share their insights and provide an independent perspective. Our goal is to uncover the stories behind their success and understand the principles that guide their decisions in life, family, and business. Through these conversations, we hope to become better investors. Today, we welcome Will Silverman, Managing Director at Eastdil Secured, based in New York City, where he focuses on institutional investment sales and capital markets transactions across a range of real estate asset classes. With over 2 decades of experience spanning investment banking and commercial real estate brokerage, Will has advised on billions of dollars of transactions, including complex asset sales, joint ventures, and recapitalizations. Prior to joining Eastdil, Will held senior roles at Hodges Ward Elliott and Savills. He began his career at JP Morgan. Will is a rare breed, a true intellectual in the world of real estate brokerage. I think you'll enjoy hearing his perspective about what investors are seeking from real estate and why trophy properties experience inelastic demand. Will loves mentoring young people and is known for his unique perspective on career advice. Please welcome to today's show, Will Silverman. Will, thanks for joining us. Now, before we get into it, as you know, I like to start all of these conversations the same way. Will, what is your declaration?
I've thought a lot about this, Todd, and I've listened to several of these, and I wanted to share something that's been on my mind of late. My declaration is that it's always a good idea to pretend someone's watching. And what do I mean by that? This stems from something we do in the office, which is if we're ever wondering if what we're doing is the right thing to do, we always say, if the client were in the room right now watching what we are doing, would they be happy or would they be disappointed? If they would be happy, you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And if they would be disappointed, do something else. And I found that there's a logic in that that applies to a lot of aspects of life. I found that if I'm with my children and having a moment of frustration, which can happen from now to then, that it helps me to think about, gee, if I were being recorded right now, am I acting in a way that I'd be happy about seeing myself? If I'm exercising and I think, gee, if my future self were watching me right now, would it want me to give up or would it want me to keep going? And this also obviously has many ethical implications. And for those for whom religion is a big part of their lives, I think there is a lot of merit to in believing that God is always watching. And so this idea that you're going to be your best self if you think that someone's watching, and that someone can be God, it can be an imaginary client, it can be your future self, it can be your children's future memories, you're always going to do better.
I love that. You know, in my own family growing up, my dad always used to say that his guiding principle was that everything he did, he wanted to make sure that his father would be proud and that his children would be proud. And I always thought it's a very similar concept. So I love hearing that. Let's hear about what influenced you in that way. So if I remember, you grew up in Queens, you moved to California for a little bit, but ended up a New Yorker again. Take us back to the early days. Maybe what did you learn about yourself that led to, this feeling about wanting to always act ethically, always act as if someone's watching?
Well, I think I can also tell you what led to the interest in New York City and in real estate, because it actually ties very much to the move. So as you mentioned, I grew up in Queens, and then halfway through high school, we moved to San Diego. And it was a culture shock in 2 regards. One was East Coast to West Coast, and one was, semi-urban. I wasn't in a particularly densely populated section of Queens. I was in the, what I would call above ground pool and aluminum siding section, and moved to a very nice suburb in San Diego. And so I had the culture shock of going city to suburbs and also going East Coast to West Coast. But the other part of it was that I had attended high school at the Bronx High School of Science for 2 years. And one of the benefits of that school is that you get to meet kids from all over the city. And I had discovered Manhattan. And I was just at the beginning of discovering Manhattan, because that's where you would go. Because if it was kids from all over the city, one place to meet was always in the city. And I think a formative experience for me was leaving that just as I was getting started on it, probably left me with a potentially over romanticized notion of what New York City was. And that, combined with a grandmother that I was particularly close to, lived and worked in Manhattan when I was a kid. And that combination of factors led to a circumstance where years later, when I discovered that there was a job where you could sell buildings in New York City, I didn't know that was a job until after I was already working. It did not occur to me that someone could sell a skyscraper. And so when I found out that that was a job, I really knew that that's what I wanted to do, because it seemed too good to be true that that was an available pursuit for humans.
So you never lost your romantic love with New York City, it sounds like.
I really didn't. And it's probably misguided at times, as so many romantic projections are, but it is something that probably stems from that.
Well, but you weren't always in New York, because after the West Coast, if I remember, didn't you go to Tufts? So that's up in Boston. And you somehow studied international relations and if I remember, Latin American politics. The only reason I remember that is that I also studied Latin America in college.
Yeah, I took an interest in international relations because it was Tufts' strongest program, and a lot of the university's resources were concentrated around it. I knew I wanted to learn another language, and so Spanish made sense. And that was a requirement of the major, was that you learned another language, and I learned to speak Spanish fluently. And the Latin American part was because I had this idea that I wanted to have a do well by doing good career. And so I really did want to end up either in academia or working at the Inter-American Development Bank or the World Bank. Because I also had a vague notion that business was a little more cutthroat than I would prefer. And so I wouldn't necessarily like it. And then I had my first internship of a serious nature at a boutique M&A shop in Madrid, Spain, working for two guys who were leading finance guys there. It's called GBS Finanzas. And I discovered that the people were quite nice, and the way they conducted business was ethical. And it was really not remotely as incompatible with my own sensibilities as I thought. And I revised my view on business and then came back. And at that point, I was already pretty deeply into my Latin American political economy studies. And so I shifted my focus to more of the economics than the politics to prepare for a career in business. The other thing was that in both high school and in college, I was on the debate team. And I would say that my real education was every weekend for 7 years arguing with really, really, really smart kids at the top schools in America about a wide variety of topics.
That might be more cutthroat. I don't know which is more cutthroat, the world of Latin American politics, the world of high school and college debate, or maybe now business.
But well, there's that old Gore Vidal line of the rivalry is so vitriolic precisely because the stakes are so small. And that applies very much in the debate team world.
But you got out and you decided to join business. If I remember, you joined JP Morgan, which again, so did I. But then you got out for some reason after investment banking, you got into real estate. And I've always viewed you as one of the scrappy ones, one of the hardworking. And I mean that as a compliment. How did you get into real estate? What was it that got you in here?
So while I was at JP Morgan, I realized that investment banking was not necessarily for me. I felt like it was too removed from the product. I was in the diversified industrials group, and I was working on mergers for companies like Ingersoll Rand or Danaher, and effectively companies that produced things that I really couldn't understand how they worked. And so there's a certain disenfranchisement in that, or at least for me there was. So at the same time, I got involved in investing in a restaurant, PJ Clark's, that was dominated by real estate people. And at the closing night of that restaurant, I met a guy named Steve Siegel, who's a legendary figure in the business. And Steve, in his very avuncular fashion, called me over and put his arm around me and said, you seem like a bright kid. Here's my card. Call Dolores. Come and see me. And so I called a bunch of people who I had met in real estate, and I said, it looks like I have Steve Siegel's here. What should I ask for? And they said, well, he just hired this guy named Woody Heller. And Woody is the guy who sold the Chrysler building in the Citigroup Center. The Citigroup Center is the triangular one on Lexington Avenue. And they said, you should try to work for him. And so I show up in Steve's office and we have a chat. And I said, I really love to meet this Woody Heller character. So he arranges for me to meet with Woody, and I have the most unusual interview of my life with Woody. I walked into Woody's office and he invites me to sit down, and he's on the phone. And he's on speaker, I think, because I could hear the conversation. And he's having this whole conversation, goes on for about 10 minutes. And as he's hanging up, he says, okay, what building was I talking about? And I had a guess, and he said, who's the retail tenant of that building? I had a guess. Cross streets is that building on? Thought I knew. And then he shifted. He said something along the lines of, did you notice that my tone shifted at a particular point? When do you think that was, and what do you think I was trying to accomplish? And at that moment, I said, this is somebody I really want to work with, because this is the, for lack of a better term, game above the game. That is really what I want to learn.
And you ended up working with him for how long?
Well, I didn't get the job.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I did not get the job. So we had a 2-hour conversation, and Woody ultimately said, this is great. You seem like a really bright kid. Unfortunately, you are too green. You have no real estate experience, and I need someone who can help right away. So this was in the summer of 2002. And over the course of the summer, I sent him writing samples. I sent him presentations I had made. I would clip articles and write questions about them. I would get more recommendation letters. I knew this was the guy I wanted.
Wow, you wanted this job.
I wanted the job very badly. And so finally, I gave up. Because he just said, look, he said, you're a nice kid, but I just need somebody who can help right away. And so I called Steve and I said, maybe I should talk to a leasing broker, which is the other business that they did at Insignia ESG back then. And so he arranged for me to meet somebody about a leasing job. And I emailed Woody and said, I'm going to be in so-and-so's office. Maybe I could stop by for a cup of coffee just to keep the relationship warm. And so while I'm in the interview with that guy, and this is before a time, but I think people remember this, people would go to great lengths to not call someone on their cell phone first. It was almost considered rude. And so while I'm in this interview, the guy who I'm interviewing with, his phone rings and he picks it up and he says, it's for you, which is kind of like getting a pizza sent to class, right? Like somebody's calling me during my job interview, and it's Woody. And he said, stop by. And so I stopped by and he said, what are you doing today? I said, nothing. I said, at this point, I'd left JP Morgan. And he says, why don't you work here today? And I said, I'll tell you why not, as you keep telling me, because I'm too green. He said, well, I've got a client who I sold an office building for who wants me to sell 2 nursing homes that he owns. And even though we've told him we don't know anything about nursing homes and have never sold one. So today, what I need is a kid who sounds good on the phone to try to call all the nursing homes around these 2 in concentric circles and see if the owners are interested. So we did that day. And the next day was a Friday. And I remember it was my father's birthday, the Thursday. And so it was early October. And on the Friday, I walked into Woody's office and I said, so what are we doing here? And he said, how about this? Next week, come and work on these deals during the day. And at night, Carly Miller, who now runs asset management at PGIM, but at that point where she was working with Woody, will give you homework assignments on real estate. And if it's working, at the end of the week, you're hired. And if it's not, I'll cut you a personal check based on your after-tax salary at JP Morgan for your time. And that began.
What a great opportunity.
It was a great opportunity, and it began a 13-year relationship and partnership that I'm deeply grateful for.
So you worked with Woody for 13 years, and then at some point you decided to go off on your own. What led to that?
Well, I think there's a point where you say you want to try your own thing, right? I learned a ton from Woody, and he really brought me to the dance and got me into rooms and circumstances that I never would have seen at such a young age. And one of the great things was we were a very small team. So by dint of that, I kind of had to do a lot of different things. But it reached a point where I really wanted to know if I was capable of doing this on my own and wanted to figure that out. And it was right around the time my first children were born. And so it just seemed like the appropriate moment for a life transition.
And what was it like on your own? What were some of the lessons that you had learned working with a team? And then what was different about needing to build it from the ground up?
When I started at Hodges Ward Elliott, which was very, very strong in the hotel business, and they realized that their 5 or 6 biggest clients all owned real estate other than hotels. And so they said, we're really missing an opportunity here because we have the relationships with these firms. We just need to start filling in the other verticals. And so I was hired to do that. And then shortly after I was hired, I brought in Daniel Parker, who I work with today, and Paul Gillen to develop a everything but hotel business at Hodges Ward Elliott. I think the biggest lesson that we had was just how hard it is to build a business, even with the benefit of a brand that a lot of these companies knew very well behind us. So we set about thinking about ways we could offer service in a differentiated way because we knew unless we were very different, we were never going to survive.
So what were some of those things that you did differently from the larger shops?
So what we realized is no one's going to hire us unless they are really convinced that we're going to sell their real estate for more money than someone else. There's just no way around that. We're not going to win a tie. We're not going to win because we're nice. We're not going to win because we're really fun dinner companions. We're going to win because someone's really convinced of that. So then we said, okay, what can we do to persuade someone that we are really going to get a higher price? So the premise that we started from was pricing is, of course, a reflection of how people evaluate risk. I will pay more for something that I perceive as less risky. The more risk I see, the lower my price goes to compensate me for taking that risk. Okay, that's our premise. Well, what is risk but a reflection of the absence of information? Because if I have perfect information, I'm not taking much risk. The more imperfect my information, the less risk I'm taking. So what if we could create a circumstance where everyone else is giving people a certain baseline amount of information and therefore the risk price is a certain way, but we can remove a layer of that uncertainty and make the buyer happy too? Because what I'll tell you is that if you can get the seller a deal that would otherwise price to a 14% levered IRR and tell them that you can get the price down to a 12, that's going to increase their purchase price. And then if you say to the buyer, would you rather buy a 12 you full bulletproof on or a 14 you're queasy on? Pretty much every buyer will take that 12 they feel bulletproof on. And so the way we did this was to introduce data science. And we tried to leverage what was then the nascent field of data science to create analyses that had not yet been seen in the marketplace.
And so that's pretty innovative. So maybe I'll ask an example of a type of analysis, and then I want to come back to how that has changed over time.
Sure. So our data scientist, a guy named Tim Kiley, discovered that Michael Bloomberg had put forth this thing called the Open Data Initiative, where the city was just providing all kinds of information in the hopes that people would find a commercial use for it. So we were trying to get hired to sell a development site in Red Hook that would be very ripe for industrial. It's right next to the IKEA. We were selling it. The 601 West was the client. And they said, you seem to be clever guys. Come up with something around this. And so we said, well, the best pricing is going to come from somebody who believes they can make some sort of distribution facility there. So everybody's probably going to walk in and say, hey, look at the growth of Brooklyn. It would be a great idea to have a distribution facility there. So how can we do this differently? So one of the things that our data scientists discovered was that the Open Data Initiative kept track of every single parking ticket written in New York City. Now, why does this matter? Because every parking ticket that gets written includes the VIN number on the vehicle. And the VIN number on the vehicle has coded information in it that tells you what type of vehicle got the ticket. There are specific types of vehicles that are associated with FedEx and UPS deliveries. And rather than actually trying to park legally, FedEx and UPS just park illegally all over the place, accumulate tickets, and then try to make one global ticket deal with the city at the end of the year. So what you could track over time based on the parking tickets was whether deliveries in specific parts of Brooklyn that would be easily reached from Red Hook were increasing. So everyone else walks in the room and says, hey, we're going to sell your site to somebody who's going to do distribution. And we're going to tell them, look at Brooklyn, look at this population growth. Fantastic. We walk in with, hey, when you're trying to communicate with a tenant, what you should really do is use this information because they might not even realize just how much the scope of deliveries is increasing in this location. So it was using information, and that's how your 14 becomes a 12, right? Like that's how someone gets confident in underwriting more rent growth than they otherwise would, or less risky returns than they otherwise would.
So that's an innovative approach. And as you said, some of it was born out of necessity to try and differentiate yourself. You were at a small firm, right? First, Saville Studley, Studley at the time was really just a tenant rep firm. You guys were the first sort of investment sales group. Then at Hodges Ward Elliott, it was really a hotel firm, as you said. You were the first to do other property types. Eventually, you then joined the big leagues, right? You joined Eastdil. And when you joined, you were scrappy. You now have the benefit of the brand also. So tell me how that changed how you advised clients or how you approached the same sort of problem.
So it's very common at Eastdil to hire people from non-traditional brokerage shops because they find that they often thrive. And I think the thesis behind it is if you take somebody who has had to try to win business without the benefit of the business card, and then you give them the business card, it's effectively like handing your jungle hunter a new bazooka, right? So for me, it was very, very exciting. And I partnered with Gary Phillips, who was hired at the same time to run the New York equity business. And for us, one of the big things was the culture of collaboration. Now, Eastdil's a little bit different from most other real estate advisory firms in that, as you pointed out, we have a real estate investment banking model. Now, what does that really mean? It really means that we're compensated in a salary and bonus. And that's different from most firms where people are compensated by individual commissions. And there's two impacts of the commission thing. One is people spend half their time arguing with each other about commission, and they spend the other half figuring out how to jockey for position on a transaction to grab as big a share of the commission as possible. You'll notice that the client hasn't yet entered the equation in either of these discussions, right? Whereas we really do try to figure out how to put the best team on the field to leverage the business. And do it for the client. And a very quick way to become unpopular here is to become known as somebody who does not put the right team on the field and does not call the right colleagues to advance the ball on behalf of the client. So we've had the benefit of situations where we get intelligence from around the world from our platform that we can leverage for our clients. So for example, a few years ago, we were raising equity for Extel, which is probably the most prolific private developer in New York City, Gary Barnett, to build a building on Fifth Avenue. And we were looking for common equity for a spec office development in 2023. Now, luckily, our London office had just consummated a transaction with Inca, which is effectively the family foundation for IKEA. So they showed up in our New York office and said, gee, we'd really love to have a presence in Midtown Manhattan near Grand Central. It would be fantastic if it was on Fifth Avenue. Sadly, there's no brand new buildings there, so maybe we'll have to shoehorn into something already built. If one day there'd be a development site, that'd be great. And so we're able to take the relationship and then ultimately consummate a large-scale investment. They invested almost $400 million into the project.
So Eastdil has just announced a merger or recapitalization, actually with Savills, your former employer. And so in some ways, a homecoming, I guess, for you. I think this is the third or the fourth time, at least that I can remember, that Eastdil has been able to recapitalize itself with a strategic partner. So what can you say about the merger and what it means for you, for the organization, for your clients?
Well, it's not yet closed, so there's limitations on what I could say. What I will say is, for me, it is indeed a homecoming, and I am happy to report that the bulk of the people that I dealt with and knew at Savills are still there. And so I must have gotten 25 phone calls and texts within 10 minutes of the announcement from old friends. And we actually already had a pretty strong relationship. We were in the habit of going over there a couple times a year to trade notes with friends there on the leasing side. So what I will say is it's a fantastic thing personally, because I think the cultures will blend together really, really well, having experienced both. I think the other thing that'll be really beneficial is, look, Eastdil, what Roy would tell you and what Ben, rest in peace, would have told you is that every time that Eastdil's consummated one of these transactions, it's been to help serve our clients better and improve the firm. And I think we believe that adding the exposure to the intelligence garnered by the other services that they offer will enable us to deliver better service to our clients.
Let's move on to a different thing that you alluded to when you said how difficult it would be to capitalize a spec office building. I think one of the themes that is underlying that comment is the fact that the real estate market has been pretty difficult for the past five plus years, right? We've seen COVID, seen inflation, 500 basis point increase in the interest rates just from the Federal Reserve. Forget about what happened to treasuries. You've had a big shift in the regulatory environment. You live in New York. Obviously, there's been a big change to rent regulated apartments in particular. And a lot of institutional investors are really talking about pulling back their real estate allocations or maybe switching them to what they call now digital infrastructure, data centers. And so all of those headlines can paint a really negative picture, can lead you to be, pretty bearish. What's your view?
My view is that the major thing that has changed is the era of riding the beta in real estate is probably over. And the era of identifying pockets of idiosyncratic outperformance is here. And
It's a stock picker's market, you're saying.
It really is. And I know that that's become a little bit of a cliche, but it is absolutely true. I mean, some of the most successful investments we've seen so far in this cycle are precisely the ones where somebody identified the excellent asset in the market where there was otherwise headline risk. I'll give you an example. We sold a building under 2 years ago on 3rd Avenue. And 3rd Avenue was a market that people were terrified of. People would say 3rd Avenue, everything will come back but 3rd Avenue was kind of a mantra. Now, the building we were selling was probably the best building on 3rd Avenue. Now, using objective criteria, it was the tallest. That usually helps. People like that. It was one of the most modern. It was column free because it had cross bracing on the exterior. And so it was column free. And perhaps most importantly, it had excellent light and air because it didn't have deep, dark base floors. It was the same boutique floor size all the way up and down. So a problem with a lot of these buildings is 70% of the square footage is in this deep, dark 40 or 50,000 foot base floors that have a lot of columns and very few windows or poor core depths. And so that's always tough to lease. This building was recessed, so it already had great light and air because it was in a plaza and didn't have any of those issues. And finally, it was close to Grand Central. And so what we would say to people is, we're not telling you that it's a good idea to buy some sort of index fund that tracks office rents on 3rd Avenue. We're telling you that this building is probably going to outperform. And lo and behold, in the intervening 22 months, the owner was Sovereign Partners, was able to take the occupancy from the mid 50% to over 90% and sign what I believe was the first north of $100 a foot lease ever signed on 3rd Avenue.
Hi, this is Todd Rich. Thank you for listening to the Declarations podcast, where top investors and business leaders share their insights and provide an independent perspective. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Declaration Partners or listen to more episodes of the Declarations podcast, please visit our website at www.declarationpartners.com. And now back to the episode. Yeah, so what's interesting is we're seeing this, right, that from a leasing perspective, at least at the moment, office is not as dead as people thought it would be, right? There is still, in fact, demand and people are willing to pay for the great buildings. People are willing to pay high rents. From a capital markets perspective, I'm not yet sure, but you might have a better perspective there. So what do you think? I mean, are people...
Well, it's all filtering from the top down, right? So there was a moment when people would say, and then there was a few watershed moments in New York City. The first watershed moment was when we were able to get a lot of offers for 780 3rd Avenue and 180 Maiden Lane, which was a similar story. And the idea was, and this was in 2024, the idea was the market is willing to articulate the idea that it's okay to buy in an out of favor submarket so long as you're buying an excellent building, right? The market had the temerity to do that. Now, it was really only private investors that felt that way. Institutional investors weren't.
Private investors, meaning family offices willing to lean in, and not institutional investors.
The smaller the committee, the better off you were because you didn't need buy-in from a lot of people. You needed one or two people with extreme conviction. Then we sold a building called 799 Broadway, which was the first real beautiful, brand new, traditional trophy in New York City, the kind of thing that would always go to an introductory offshore buyer who really wanted just best of the best asset. And everybody wondered, and that was a deal that was offered with, 75% seller paper. And ultimately, we had competition between a European billionaire who ended up prevailing in buying the asset and open-ended German fund that was buying all equity. And neither of them ended up using the seller paper. And we looked at the bid sheet for the deal beyond just those two investors. And Gary and I looked at each other and we said, this could have been the same bid sheet 10 years ago. And for the trophy of the trophy, not the same pricing, but the same group of buyers, right? And I would argue the pricing is actually the same, because if all pricing destruction in New York City right now on higher end assets is exclusively the result of rate movement, rents are very frequently back to a better place than they were. I can't do anything about base rates, but most value diminution in New York City at this point is attributable to rates. So that was the second test. So the first test was, can the market articulate idiosyncratic demand in otherwise out of favor locations? Check. Then late 24, early 25, it was, will traditional trophy buyers a la European billionaires, German open-ended funds, etc., come back to the market? Check. And then the last test was, is the market ready for a big deal? And last year, we were fortunate enough to be engaged by our friends at Sturs, Ohio, to sell 590 Madison Avenue, which was the first north of $1 billion sale. And that too, got over a dozen bids that were fully capitalized.
What I'm hearing you say is office is not dead, certainly from a leasing perspective, and you think from a capital perspective. So let's ask a question on everyone's mind. What is the longer term impact of AI on office demand? What will happen there?
I sincerely don't know, is the short answer. I like the old Donald Rumsfeld equation
of the knowns and unknowns.
I think it's actually epistemologically a very elegant way of thinking about things. The known is that there's going to be some impact, and it feels likely that there will be less white collar work in aggregate than there used to be. The other known is that every time in human history we were fearful of an elimination of jobs and or the economy as the result of technological innovation, the opposite is what happened. Now I would call a known unknown is whether it's higher end or lower end white collar jobs that end up bearing the brunt of the impact is a different question. What it feels like people are starting to think is that higher end knowledge work probably isn't damaged that much, but back office white collar work probably is what gets eliminated. And so that actually makes for an interesting story for a place like New York City, because if you believe that New York City is the place where the talents, the smartest recent graduates are going to want to be, this might actually inure to its benefit rather than causing a challenge. Now, it makes me less excited about some secondary market that's trying to be, the back office of every law firm in America or something like that.
Well, let's stick with New York City, but now let's switch from office to now how that impacts the residential market. Because the residential market, and many people who listen to this will likely know, has been in, it's sort of a tale of two markets. On the one hand, free market multifamily rents are probably the highest they've ever been. There seems to be no upward end in sight. But owners of rent-regulated units are seeing expenses rise faster than rents. They're often facing foreclosure. In fact, even some of their banks have gone under. So maybe if you could just sort of spend a minute or two on the New York City multifamily market, please.
Well, as you identified, the free market scene is fantastic, and it's not more complicated than demand and supply. And on the demand side, there's one oft-told story and one untold story, I would say. The oft-told story is that New York City is the prime destination for young people who are coming out of school. And I think that that's true for two reasons. I think it's that New York City offers an intelligent young person the deepest high-end job market probably in the world, and also the deepest high-end dating market in the world. And everyone kind of smirks whenever we say that, but it's true. And if you ask a 25-year-old what their priorities are, it's setting up their career and setting up their life.
I will acknowledge going to New York for both of those reasons. And in fact,
many continue to do so. Many continue to do so. And the relative mind share that New York has among young people changed at a very specific moment that I think someone's going to write an excellent sociology paper about one day. The moment when New York reclaimed a lot of the mind share it had lost in the prior 10 or 15 years was the summer of 2021.
Okay, let's hear this.
In the summer of 2021, you were probably in the city at some point in that summer. Downtown in New York was a giant open air party every night of the week.
I'd say Brooklyn was more fun.
But I remember all these restaurants in the village would spill out into the streets. And it was a giant party in New York City that was being broadcast on social media to a bunch of kids around the country who were stuck in their childhood bedrooms in every other city that was shut down. And they saw that and they said, the minute I can get there, I'm going. And you can trace it if you look at job applications. We can even see it in the composition of our internship and first year analyst applications. After summer of 2021, New York starts skyrocketing. Now, the other thing that happened on the multifamily side is there's a life cycle of a renter, right? Someone gets out of school, they rent an apartment, so on and so forth. Well, there used to be release valves for that side of the market. One release valve was somebody gets older, they buy a house in the suburbs. Well, too bad we just made the suburbs 50% more expensive during COVID. Another release valve might be they buy a condominium that's reasonably priced in a recently converted building that just became condominiums from rentals, like a white brick building on the Upper East Side. Well, in 2019, the famous law changes also put a de facto prohibition on condominium conversions. So those are out, right? And so meanwhile, on the job side, we've increased the percentage of tech jobs vis-a-vis finance jobs. And the importance of that is that a tech job is more valuable to the rental market than a finance job is, for a specific reason, which is that the compensation trajectory of someone in the tech world, barring an IPO or some crazy event, is usually flatter. So the tech person is more likely to come out of school earning low six figures and 15 years later be earning low to mid six figures. The finance person might be able to afford a condo by the time they're 29 and they're out of the rental pool. So every time we swap a finance job for a tech job, we're creating additional multifamily demand without needing population growth.
That's fascinating. I didn't think of that, but I would say that that probably works in concert with one of the other things you said, which is the lack of supply and the incredible expense of condominium demand, because that probably also lengthens the length of a renter.
Exactly. It totally does. And you know what a lot of those people end up doing now? They end up buying a country house in the Catskills with what would have been the down payment and staying in the rental pool even longer. So it's been a perfect storm for rentals.
Well, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Many cities in America are going through something similar, where there's an affordability issue, but then the political sentiment that seems to shift more towards controls as opposed to towards supply. Obviously, there's a countervailing argument of abundance, which is meant towards building more. We'll see which works better. I have a view that for society, abundance will work better. But
I have a view that rising supply lowers prices. It's confirmed by all kinds of math.
In any case, let's touch on something else that you mentioned, which is that you're talking about the office demand. What you found is that the investor sentiment was not coming from institutional investors, the traditional buyers historically. It's coming really more from family offices or private capital. Your words were, the smaller the investment committee, the louder a single voice could be for conviction. So maybe just to dig on that a little bit, I mean, what do you see about some of the trends? New York is such a large market with large values of buildings. You tend to have a lot of institutional investors there. I mean, do you see that continuing to retreat?
I still see institutional demand. I would say what's interesting, we should cover about the recent couple of years is it's the first time the fundamentals led the recovery before the capital markets.
I thought you were going to say it's the first time that the debt markets led the recovery instead of the equity markets.
No, it was the fundamentals. People were seeing the rent growth. So if you look at who the early buyers have been, right? SL Green, Vornado, Norges, RXR, Blackstone, Tishman Speyer, right? You look at all of these companies that have been buying. Well, not just that. They're the people who have the best information. So if the people who are underwriting the most aggressively control and Boston Properties, right? If the people that you're talking about have the most exposure to the market are the ones with the strongest bid, it's probably a good time to buy. And that has led to renewed interest from more institutions. So I think you will continue to see institutional demand. The only place where you haven't seen institutional demand come back, and it's just a function of other office investments and allocations, and to your point, the great sucking sound of the data center market, is from Odyssey funds. and kind of traditional pension fund advisors.
So the Odyssey funds, that's the open-end diversified core equity, or ODCE fund. So what those are traditionally what, core buyers? And you're saying,
yeah, those are traditional core buyers and traditionally made up a huge segment of the market, and we have not yet seen them return to office.
so there's still a huge redemption queue there.
There's redemption queues and denominators and, hangover from other investments. It's hard to take a loss on an asset type and at the same time tell your investors you want to buy more of it, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the fact that we've had so much conviction, and it's kind of the same as a lot of the retail users, it's always a great sign. There was that old, I keep on saying it's a Cy Sims market. There was those
So
old...
explain, for those who don't know who
So Cy Sims was a discount retailer, and the bags from his stores used to say, "An educated consumer is our best customer." And when that's the case, so when you see the most prolific office owners with the best access to the fundamentals on the ground being the strongest bid, and when you see the most successful retail companies in the world being the biggest retail buyers, I think it tells you everything you need to know.
Let's
about the
spend a
health of those
second talking about
markets.
retail. I know you've done a lot of work recently working with some of the world's biggest brands. In many cases, they seem to not just want to lease their space, but they seem to want to buy it, and they seem to be willing to pay ever higher prices. What are they thinking? What's happening in that world?
I think they're thinking a few things, and it runs the gamut from mass market to luxury. On the luxury side, they're in an interesting place where they're effectively running three businesses out of a store. And the three businesses are this. At the grade level of most of these stores, they are selling birthday and anniversary presents to mere mortals like us. People who will shop there once a year to 3 times in a lifetime. Upstairs, they are offering a VIC, as they call it, a very important customer, a very important client, experience that is very, very well amenitized, high touch, and might have people walking out with tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of goods.
Please don't tell my wife about that part of it.
Exactly. But here's the third part. When those amenity areas are not being used to host the royal family of whatever country for a shopping afternoon, they can be used as the backdrop for the creation of social media content.
Interesting.
But you have to have a space that's pretty impressive to do that. So now if I want to have a wow space, if you've been to the first floor of Tiffany since they redid it.
They redid it. It's great.
Beyond spectacular.
It really is.
If I want to have a wow space there, and I want to have an incredible VIC space that I'll be proud to host clients that spend $200,000 or $300,000 every time they visit my shop. And it's going to be a space that's going to have visually interesting features that people are going to use to create social media content. The greatest social media campaign in the history of luxury retail is happening on 57th Street and 5th Avenue right now, where Louis Vuitton is famously, instead of just putting up scaffolding, turned it into trunks.
Yeah, it's a Louis Vuitton
Right?
trunk.
The most effective advertising spend, I think.
And every
in the
time
history
I
of
walk
luxury.
by, there are hundreds of people taking pictures of themselves, which I presume get uploaded to their social media.
So this is the point, is if I'm trying to run all three of those businesses, I need to make a massive capital investment. And if I'm going to make a massive capital investment, why would I put myself into a circumstance where my landlord will know that I've made that massive capital investment? And even if I might have a little bit of leverage right now because the market isn't what it was, or at least until recently isn't what it was 10 years ago, I'm going to get killed on a renewal. So better for me to buy my space, know that I've got it forever, know that the money that I am spending is an investment that I have a better chance of recouping on. And also what a lot of these retailers are alerted to is the rents, particular in some places on Fifth Avenue, 2 years ago, and even as recently as a year ago, were still half of what they were 10 years ago.
Soho, it's moved up a little quicker, but the larger spaces.
And you're already seeing it. You're already seeing $5,000 rents come back to Upper Fifth Avenue. And so you're seeing that strategy turned out to have been prudent.
Let's move from real estate fundamentals to maybe some of the personal skills that are required to either invest in or to broker great real estate properties. I think in some ways, real estate investing, and maybe particularly New York, where the negotiating characters are more intense, it differs from public market investing. It's not just identifying an opportunity, pushing a button and buying or selling it. You now need to convince a seller to select you as the buyer or as the broker. You need to negotiate with tenants, with lenders, with joint venture partners. You have to navigate a sales process. Tell me, what are the things that you think differentiates either investors or brokers? Like, how does one succeed in this world?
Well, let's start with investors, because I'm guessing that the preponderance of your listeners are people
That's
from
right.
that community.
Yeah, I wasn't asking you to give your brokerage advice to competitors.
So I think there's a few things. I think the first is don't underestimate user friendliness. People who are easy to deal with, people who only raise issues when there's a substantive reason to do so, people who call back when they say they're going to call back. Woody taught me this early in my career. He would say the best call you can make is to call someone to say, I don't have anything to tell you yet, but I told you I would stay in touch. And here's when I think I'll have something to tell you, and I'll call you then with an update. Right. So, because everyone likes it. No one likes radio silence. So that's the first thing, is just user friendliness. The second is, and I'll tell you, I've had the benefit of working with some clients who are extraordinarily brilliant deal makers, and I'll call out Jeff Sutton and Gary Barnett, because while they have very, very different styles, they have this in common. They both perceive their role as trying to solve everyone else's problems. They're not here to impose their will upon the deal. They're here to understand what everyone else in the deal needs and figure out a way to solve everyone else's problems. And they both come at it with different styles, but they both come at it
with that orientation. And
in terms of the traits on the brokerage side. Look, I've had the benefit of having some really, really fantastic mentors. I had my parents, who were both salesmen. I had my grandmother, who was a very, very prolific salesman. And then I had Woody Heller, Mark Elliott, and Roy March.
What did they sell, by the way?
My parents were both jewelry salesmen. And my grandmother was a very, very high grossing salesperson selling perfume on the floor at Saks Fifth Avenue and Fifth Avenue. And she was prolific. And she was probably one of the hardest working people in sales. She had a habit which led to her success, which is when she would meet a new client, she would write down, when she checked their driver's license verify their credit cards, because she was always very diligent about that. She would write down their birthday and their home address. And no matter how trivial their purchase, every night she would spend several hours writing thank you cards and birthday cards to anyone who had ever bought anything from her.
In some ways, people would think now that's so easy. It's an automated email, right? And yet I love the idea of writing handwritten thank you notes. I think it is an underappreciated skill or forgotten skill. And I know you do it as well sometimes. And it's great training. Anyway, so you were going to say the second thing.
So my parents each have very different styles. My father is a very classic presentation style and is an excellent presenter and an excellent speaker. And my mother is more relationship driven and is more the kind of person who will be so blunt and candid in her relationship with a buyer. If someone doesn't make a decision that she thinks is the right one, she'll question if there are certain aspects of their personal life that might be lacking at the moment that might lead them to be in a negative frame of mind. But what she does when she does that is she creates a circumstance where people know that if she's always speaking from the heart and they can trust her. So I had that combination of my father having very traditional, excellent presentation skills and always thinking about things from the perspective of the buyer. How can we solve their problem? And my mother's very empathetic version and my grandmother's hardworkingness. And then I had Woody, who gave me an education in negotiation and finding leverage where it might not have been there. And then Mark Elliott and Roy March. I mean, Mark, rest in peace. Mark was one of the named partners at Hodges Ward Elliott, a legendary figure in the hotel business. And a man who saw conflict coming from further away than anyone I've ever met. Roy March, our CEO, is, of course, a legendary figure in our business, who similarly is able to keep track of so many different things and fit the pieces of what's going on the puzzle of global capital markets together in a way that is like nothing I've ever seen.
It's all on the one index card he keeps inside his lapel. So I don't know how he does it.
It's really incredible, but his ability to anticipate what's going to happen in the market and what's going to be important, I've witnessed to be nothing I've ever seen. And his deep commitment to that and to using that to help our clients is very real.
Now, you've talked a lot about these interpersonal skills. Really, that's what you were focusing on. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But I actually regard you as one of the more intellectual players in our industry. And I'll acknowledge real estate brokerage is not known as an intellectual place.
A little more, yeah.
But, you and I frequently talk about the importance of reading books. How do you think reading has shaped you? And why do you think it's been important to your success?
I think that the more expansive your worldview, the more you're going to stimulate your own creativity. And so I find that reading for me is the biggest one, but it's also engagement with art or whatever is the part of the creative world that moves you, can just expand the way you think about things and inspire you in different ways. For this year, so there's often books that have a big impact on me. One I'd highly recommend was written by a guy named Josh Waitzkin called The Art of Learning. And you recognize that name because he's the protagonist of the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer.
Wow. Okay.
And in addition to a chess champion, he was also a push hands Tai Chi champion. And he wrote a book about learning that I think was great. But in terms of broader speaking and engagement with fiction and things like this, the ideas that you pick up. So I was in Rome with my childhood friends for our kind of annual guys trip last year, and we saw a painting that sat with me a lot. And the painting was called The Bean Eater. And you can look it up if you're looking at this. It's a very famous painting. And what's interesting about the painting is that you'll be shocked to see when it was painted. Because it's from either the 15th or 16th century, but it's a painting of a peasant eating a bowl of beans that's kind of spilling, and he's looking at you, which is subject matter you really didn't see. I mean, this is back when people were really just painting nobles and popes, all right, and iconography. And so the idea that there were people who were looking at the world and looking at what the rest of the art was, and with no exposure to them, there's no magazines, there's no media, there's no television, there's no internet, just born of their own creativity to say something different, were doing things that were that incredible a departure from what everyone else is doing, is really inspiring. And so that's where the inspiration comes from is if somebody was able to anticipate movements in the art world by 200 years, hopefully we can come up with a novel narrative about an office building that feels 6 months ahead of its time.
Well, I think you get great enjoyment out of these things, but you look for similar skill set, I think, in potential job candidates. And I know, everyone sends resumes. You probably get resumes all the time, but you like to give people, different types of career advice about their resumes. And separately, you like to test their cultural literacy, which is maybe going back to the prior question. So we can take this in either order, but I want to touch on both. Maybe first, cultural literacy.
Is this the notorious quiz?
Yeah, right. You ask it, right. So you very famously ask the cultural literacy quiz of many job candidates. You sometimes do it for fun with other folks. I'm one of the people who has been subjected to it. Tell the world what it is and why.
So it's a hodgepodge list of cultural literacy questions that I have generally and arbitrarily decided are worth knowing. It was inspired by a quiz that a friend of mine clerked for a famous judge in Louisville named Judge Boggs. And Judge Boggs, and you can Google this. If you Google the Judge Boggs quiz, you'll find it. And his was much more esoteric. It was, name 3 famous Hectors from antiquity, right? Everybody knows one. Right. So
I guess
it was like
a federal judge, you probably need to have a little bit more esoteric skill than perhaps
this was
real estate broker.
This kind of stuff. So minor everything from what is the first commandment to what are the major rivers of London, Paris, and Rome to who was Helen Gurley Brown and what is Chanel's most famous fragrance and a whole bunch of other things. There's a wide range. So the point that I'm trying to make with the cultural literacy quiz is that I think that a well-intentioned but misguided part of our educational system is we spend a long time, hundreds of years, emphasizing rote memory, right? When was the Magna Carta 1215? When was the 30 Years' War 1618 to 1648? Okay. So then when we were kids, it really swung back to it's not as important that you know the exact dates of these things. It's important that you know causes, effects, themes, etc. What I've come to understand is that the most powerful way to use information is to do both, but to do both, which is to have an analytical framework that you can apply to an excellent command of the facts. And the example I would use is I'll ask a lot of the young people, do you have strongly held opinions about organized religion? And more frequently than not, they do. Some are very religious, some are not very religious, but most people have a view of some kind. It's not a topic of ambivalence for many. And then you say to them, great, what's the first commandment? And almost none of them identify it correctly. Almost everyone says
there is one God.
There is one God, no God but God. And you say to them, do you think that piece of information would be relevant as you try to form a view of religion? And pretty obviously the answer is yes. And that kind of crystallizes this idea that you're going to be the most powerful version of yourself if you have an excellent command of the facts, and I can't make that anything other than rote memory. If you have an excellent command of the facts and also an excellent ability to analyze and explain. And the reason that there's the breadth of it is you never know what kind of person you're going to have to relate to. And so it's important to have the breadth of knowledge, because if you're relating to someone who has no framework for what you're talking about, but you're trying to say that this is the signature thing, well, maybe you want to say, this is their Chanel number 5. Oh, okay, got it. Right? Or the Hudson River is our Danube, whatever you want to use. But so the point is that there's utility in knowing these things beyond just the fun roadness.
I just read a book by David Epstein called Range, which actually specifically talks about how having less specialization and more of a widespread approach allows for creativity and allows actually for most innovations in the world have come from that. So I'm
definitely going to read that. That's very, I'm an unwitting practitioner.
Let's move on to now. How does one, besides giving people the quiz, I imagine this is very difficult for people to make known in their typical resume. So as you get a resume from someone or people ask for job advice, you give 2 pieces of career advice.
2 pieces of advice.
Yeah.
So one is that resumes are a problem and an opportunity. The problem with resumes is that as much as you don't like making them, we don't like reading them. And the reason is that they all basically sound the same. They don't leave you with a very accurate sense of the person. They are frequently written in a form of resume speak that bears no resemblance to how any human being has ever spoken aloud or written before.
What's your advice then?
My advice is a few things. Number one, when it comes to describing things you did, please don't say you were the interdepartmental liaison for whatever. Write a few bullets about what you did. Hand your resume to a friend who doesn't know about your internship and ask them to say back to you what they think you did at that internship based on what you have written. Revise until what they say matches what you did. Very simple. The second is, since everyone's resumes are basically the same, and since we're always looking for excuses to eliminate them, sorry, but we're looking for excuses to eliminate resumes when you have a big pile of them, figure out a way to differentiate yourself. And I'll give you one great example of doing this. About 20 years ago, a friend of mine sends me a resume, and he says, tell me if you notice something. And on this resume, it was a kid who had gone to Duke or something and worked at Merrill Lynch and majored in econ and played a couple sports. But then on the bottom of the resume, it said Time Magazine's Person of the Year 2006. And that'll stop you in your tracks. So what do? You Google it. And if you Google Time Magazine's Person of the Year, I think it's 2006, you find out that the Person of the Year that year was, quote, you, the citizen, you, the content creator, et cetera, et cetera. And in that one line, this kid has managed to communicate that he's a risk taker, probably has a sense of humor, probably creative, probably somebody, the famous test, would you mind being stuck in an airport with this person? It communicated all of those things. Now, unfortunately, now that this one's in the public domain, that one's not available.
Can't use that one. You have to come up with your own one.
Everyone lists their interests. And by the way, if photography were as popular in life as it seems to be on resumes, then Leica would be a $100 billion company. But the reality is why not put things like favorite works of art, favorite novels, right? Last 3 books you read, something of this nature, something that tells us something about who you are intellectually. So that's the resume part. The other part that we encourage everybody to do.
This is the second piece now. We're getting the second piece of advice.
This is the you will get a job, or at least an interview piece. Is if you're looking for jobs in real estate, almost every job in real estate at some point involves arguing for or against making a particular investment. right? Everyone's job can be boiled down to that in real estate capital markets.
Or in most of finance.
In most of finance. So we say is pick an investment thesis. It can be whatever you want. It can't be data centers are going to be huge because of AI. It's got to have some novelty to it. And make a little investment deck. Because it puts you in a position where saying, well, I can't tell you how I think, but I can show you. And I can show you how I've thought about this particular thesis. And it does several things. Number one, it shows that you're already willing to work harder than other people, right? The second thing it does is it changes the really awkward dynamic of the resume interview conversation. It's always a weird series of questions that never come up in natural conversation. Well, instead, you can say to someone, why don't we just talk through my investment thesis? And maybe you could share some thoughts about it, right? So now you're making someone feel like what it would be like to work with you, which is kind of a subliminal sales tactic of making it feel more real. And then the last thing you're doing is you're eliminating the asymmetry of expertise, because one of the best, for examples of these, there was a young woman who went to Fordham University, and she took it upon herself to do a force ranking of the top off-campus properties to buy with a deep analysis of each one. And her overriding thesis was you should buy the ones that are next to a dorm because they get the de facto benefit of campus security without having to pay for it. Great thesis.
Good
right?
thesis.
But the point is I may know more about real estate than she does, but she knows more about what it's like to live on Fordham University's campus than I do. And so she has eliminated the asymmetry of the conversation. So if you do all of those things and you present with an interesting thesis, I think the odds that you'll get the interview go way up and the odds that you get the job go way up.
I think it's great advice. Let's end there and go to what I call the closing questions. One of which you may have answered, but we'll see. You did give a book recommendation, but I like to ask, what book most influenced your thinking or your personal development?
So I'm not sure which book most influenced my thinking or personal development. I would say that The Art of Learning stuck with me quite a bit. And I find myself years after reading it, returning to things that it said. It was originally recommended. My friend Peter Rumble had done a job interview, and Waitskin was actually part of his interviewing process. Waitskin also works as an executive coach. But I think a lot about it. It has particularly excellent chapters on how to handle difficult people in difficult situations and to truly view them as an opportunity to improve and not just giving that lip service, but really changing your frame of mind around it. So that was one. I also recommend to everyone, and it's not for every stage of life, I think that the first book of Proust's In Search of Lost Time, Swan's Way, is an unbelievable thing to read and something that everyone should check out at some point in their life.
Many will be intimidated by Proust, but you're here you are on a podcast recommending it.
The thing about it is there's that saying, everything's in Proust. Everything really is in Proust. And what's inspiring about it is this was a guy who spent half of his life bedridden, yet his insights into interpersonal relationships and dynamics are unbelievable. And I would say the hard is part of it, right? Like the difficultness of it is also its reward. So I wouldn't say necessarily that it has influenced my thinking on a day-to-day basis, but the idea that someone could be that insightful based on such limited exposure to people is inspiring in terms of the scope of his achievement.
What is the best advice that you've received from your parents or that you now give to your own children?
When I was in 9th or 10th grade, I was doing okay, but not great in school. And my father effectively gave me a speech where there was a conceit in it that gave it a lot of credibility. He said, you're not going to do terrible in life. He said, you've got too many natural gifts and you're pretty good at stuff and you're clever enough and you're a good speaker and presenter. So you'll be okay. So the path for you having a good life is perfectly fine. But if you apply yourself just a little bit, you have the availability to have a life and career and existence that's really great. And you owe it to yourself to really explore that. And candidly, you'll be amazed how little you have to put in to make that adjustment. And I think that stuck with me a lot. And it's something that I think about with my own children. The amount of incremental effort you have to put in to materially change outcomes is much less than I think people think.
That's inspirational. The most famous sentence in the Declaration of Independence talks about rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, Will, what do you do in pursuit of happiness?
I spend time with my children. I have three sons who are 12, 12, and 11. I have identical twins, and they have a younger brother. So I spend time with them and reached very, really fun stage of ages for them. We're firmly in the stage of life where we do things like try to convince each other that it says gullible on the ceiling and play all kinds of little fun pranks. So that's really a joy. And increasingly trying to start to explore the world with them is a lot of fun. And then I have a group of friends who are my friends since childhood, who some of whom have been kind of added onto along the way. And we remain very close. And once a year, and we did it a couple weeks ago, once a year, we all get together to explore a different place together. And it's been anything from, places like Rome and Paris to Boston or South Carolina. But spending that time and focusing on those connections and friendships is huge. And I like to hike a lot. I live in Connecticut and I live near a park with hiking trails, and usually at least one morning a week at sunrise, I try to be out there on the hiking trails.
Will, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights. I said it earlier, but I'll say it again. I do think, and maybe it was the Proust, but I do think that you are a true intellectual here in the world of real estate. And I think your advice to young people and to those of us who are practitioners in the space is invaluable and entertaining as always. So thank you for joining.
Thank you very much for having me, Todd. It was really fun.
This podcast is provided for discussion and informational purposes only, for use by Declaration Partners LP, together with its affiliates, referred to as Declaration. The information discussed in this podcast may change at any time without notice, and there is no duty by Declaration to update any person to whom this information is provided. This podcast does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to purchase any investment product or any interest in the fund or any other investment vehicles or accounts managed or advised by Declaration, a Declaration investment product, in any jurisdiction to any person. Any such offer or solicitation for interest in any Declaration investment product will only be made pursuant to such Declaration investment products' definitive offering documents, which contain a description of the material terms, including risk factors, conflicts of interest, fees and charges, and regulatory and tax considerations relating to such Declaration investment product, and which should be reviewed carefully by potential investors prior to making an investment decision. This podcast does not constitute tax or legal advice. The listener is urged to consult a professional tax and/or legal advisors regarding the possible tax, legal, economic, regulatory, or other risks and consequences associated with any investment, and must be able to bear the risks involved. This podcast may contain certain forward-looking statements, which constitute Declaration's views with respect to future events, which can be identified by the use of forward-looking terminology, such as intend, seek, expect, target, project, or endeavor. These statements are made based upon such views as they exist as of the date herein. There is no assurance that such views are correct or will prove, with the passage of time, to be correct. Actual events or results may differ materially from those contemplated by such forward-looking statements as a result of factors beyond Declaration's control, including, without limitation, any disruptions in global, regional, or local financial, credit, or real estate markets, acts of God, fire, hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, earthquakes, or other natural disasters, outbreaks of an infectious disease, pandemic, or any other serious public health concern, war, terrorism, labor strikes, electricity shortages, or other national or local emergencies, or any combination of the foregoing. David M. Rubenstein is an anchor investor in Declaration Partners Real Estate Fund II and is not an employee of Declaration. Neither the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission nor the Securities Regulatory Authority of any state or other jurisdiction has passed upon the accuracy or adequacy of this podcast. No compensation has been awarded to any speaker for statements made that are either testimonials or endorsements. However, certain speakers may be current or former investors in certain Declaration investment products and may receive reduced fees, priority terms, priority access, co-investment rates, among other preferential treatment, which may pose a conflict of interest. Certain speakers may also be affiliates and/or service providers that receive compensation from Declaration for services provided in their service provider capacity, but have not been compensated specifically for any testimonials or endorsements made herein. The views expressed in this podcast by either the guest speaker or the host are their own and may not reflect the views of their firm or its affiliates or of Declaration. The comments made are for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered investment, legal, or tax advice, nor a recommendation or offer to buy or sell any security or investment product. Any references to advisory services, private investments, or wealth management practices are general in nature and not indicative of future results. Past performance is not indicative of future outcomes. Examples and observations shared by the guest speaker are illustrative only and may not reflect actual client experiences. Listeners should consult their own professional advisors regarding their individual circumstances. The guest speaker may have professional relationships that could present potential conflicts of interest related to statements made by the speaker. Consequently, from the foregoing, no reliance whatsoever should be placed on this podcast, and no decision, including any investment decision, should be made based on this podcast or on the information contained herein.